Nation plenary, given that the new king of the UK is an environmental and climate change activist for what, 30 years now, Kamiar, or something like that? More? Okay. So, well, I would like to thank the ERF management for inviting me first to start with, and for organizing this very important panel, and actually inviting a handful of distinguished panelists to discuss the green economy and energy transition in order to, with a focus on growth and development. Our first distinguished speaker is Professor Atif Kobrosi. He's a professor emeritus of economics at McMaster University. He is also the president of econometric research, and he joined actually in 1982 the UNIDO as a senior development, and also he has served as the executive secretary of the UN ESCWA, and he has published extensively in areas of macroeconomics, economic development, strategies, international trade, and many other. And he is our one and only Dr. Atif Kobrosi. I think that everybody in the room and online knows him in person very well. Our Dr. Atif will give us an overview actually of the challenges and impacts of climate change on the transition to green energy in selected Arab countries, where he will be followed by Dr. Hélène Diouf-Pelkit. C'est correct, which is she is the director of the Economic Diagnostics and Public Policy Department at AFD, which is Agence Française du Développement, the French Agency for Development, and she is in charge of matters related to social cohesion and human development, as well as governance and the commons. Hélène will set the scene actually and will tailor, I would say, a framework for going to the main, what would be the main directions in order to achieve structural transformation and to achieve a green transition. After the scene is set by Dr. Atif and Hélène, we will be having an intervention from Dr. Homi Kharas, who is kindly with us over the Zoom meeting, where he is a senior fellow of the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institute. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University, and he served at the World Bank for almost 3 decades in various positions. Homi will actually try to tell us how we will be able to finance all this transformation and the transition. Finally, our final panelist is Kamiar Muhaddas, he is a macroeconomist at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge and a fellow economics at the King's College, Cambridge. Kamiar is very well published in very distinguished journals, and his area of research are applied macroeconomics, global and national macroeconometric modeling. Without further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Atif Kobrosi to give his speech on climate change and transition to green energy. Dr. Atif, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Hada. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Climate change is already with us.
No, but I guess you would like.
Yeah, climate change is already with us. This region of ours contributes so little to emissions, less than 4%, yet it bears a very large and very devastating impacts from it. Whether this is going to be in terms of rise in temperature, rise in the sea level, in terms of the spread of disease, in terms of unexpected climate events, the consequences are going to be massive and large. The story is absolutely and very much a story also of the fact that this region that depends so heavily, so extensively on fossil fuel would have to contend with the transformation, the likely expectation, the high probability that fossil fuels will become stranded assets. To keep the temperature, world temperature, at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial time requires that we keep all, if not the highest percentage of coal in the ground and about 50% of oil and gas in the ground and not to be used. And if this were to happen, it's going to reduce the value of the assets that the region depends so heavily on. If we look at the region in terms of the direct dependence on oil and gas, it says only 40% and even declining. But this would give a distorted, truncated, unrealistic picture. Because if you factor in the indirect, the induced impacts, I mean, imagine, could you think of the Saudi Arabian economy having a banking system, having a services system, the government expenditures, the generous programs without oil. So to a great extent, if one would factor in the indirect and the induced, the dependence on fossil fuel would rise to about 90%. And that is very high percentage. No other economy has experienced this heavy dependence. There is also this presumption, and I would like to challenge it, that there are Arab countries that are oil exporting and there are Arab countries just oil importing. Unfortunately, if one looks at the different and intricate web of relationships between the oil exporting and the oil importing Arab countries through immigration, through transfers, through remittances, through tourism, through investments, through exports, one would really get the picture that in the Arab world, we really have oil exporting countries and non-oil Arab countries because of that heavy dependence. So to some extent, what this is going to do is it's going to threaten the very sustainability of these economies, whether they are Arab exporting oil or non-Arab or non-oil Arab countries. And that this heavy dependence on oil and the possible transfer of the assets into lower values is going to compromise the vitality, the vibrancy, and the ability of these economies to maintain and sustain the standards of living and activities that they have been accustomed to. The challenge then is, according to the carbon tracker, that at stake is $28 trillion in direct oil revenues and in the infrastructure that has been built around it, whether of gas stations or oil companies and so on and so forth. And they have estimated that the region, our region, would lose about $10 trillion. I think to some extent this is exaggerated view. Nonetheless, we're going to lose and our losses are going to be massive. But the 10 trillion is exaggerated. And the reason for this is that the Arab oil producers till now are the most efficient producers. The cost of lifting a barrel of oil from the ground up into the tanker is still the lowest in the world. And some estimates is far below $10. I mean, imagine that in Canada, it would be around $48 to $50, if not higher. I mean, imagine that in Canada, if you really want to get a barrel of oil, you have to dig in the Rockies. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in the UAE, in many of the Arab countries, oil is at the surface, very large oil wells that are close to water, which is still the cheapest medium to transport it. So to a great extent, this fact and this efficiency of production of oil and gas in the region is going to make them the last to lose, that they can still make profits, not so much, but still make profits at very low oil prices or gas prices. But there is a challenge here, and one of the most interesting aspects of this climate change is going to unify the region, unify in the tragedy of losing these assets and in the challenge that would be required to create alternative, more sustainable, renewable assets to take place of the declining value of oil and gas. For the exporting countries, they need an export engine, a substitute to the engine that they had depended upon so heavily and have been rewarded so handsomely from it. For the oil importing countries, it becomes an issue of energy sufficiency, in the sense that once this oil and gas is not going to be used, and it would be dangerous to use, they have to find alternatives. So in both cases, whether you want to find an alternative export engine or you're going to find alternative sources of energy, the challenge is now to move towards renewable. Renewable energy, I can push this one to move. So, here it is. Okay, look at just maybe show you this one. This is the emissions that come from coal and gas and natural gas are the highest. And there is no escape that if we want to have a sustainable future, if we're going to sustain a temperature above the pre-industrial time with 1.5 degrees, there is no escape. There is no alternative other than to move off oil and gas as energy. And if you look at who are the major contributors, China, USA, Europe, India, Russia, we are nowhere on this picture. But the issue is that we are nowhere on this picture, but if you put the damage that is likely to be realized from climate change, we are on the top of the list. There are so many negative, drastic changes. Some of the highest number of deaths that are really associated with climate change, weather events. I mean, imagine, have you ever believed this, that there would be snow in Saudi Arabia? It happened just last year. And it's likely to be far more devastating impacts. And the story here is to what extent can we adhere to the Paris Protocol and to make the reduction that are necessary without really moving off oil. But moving off oil as energy does not mean moving off oil in terms of other products. I mean, the Saudis have now come strong and batting very aggressively that if you move off oil does not mean you're moving off oil totally, because oil is a very important feedstock in tires, petrochemicals of all sorts, varnish, paint, fertilizers, you name it. So to a great extent, what you're really talking here is to use oil and gas in different uses than just purely the energy that is the culprit in terms of producing the very high emissions. And there is now about 5 other factors that seem to be important. The oil-producing Arab countries have talked for years about diversifying their economy, that they cannot stake their future and the future generations on a non-renewable basis. They need to find the renewable basis for alternative sources of income and wealth. And this cannot come just from basically moving of oil as energy and gas. It's finding this other alternative lucrative exports they could. And they're finding now, and this is the fortunate thing about our region, is that if we want to move into solar energy, our region is perhaps the most endowed in terms of solar radiation, that it's a natural comparative advantage that could be generated by the new energy. And the new energy, the renewable energy, is also the cleanest. There are substantive evidence that pollution has caused innumerable number of deaths and health effects. If you were to go to renewable sources, this is the cleanest. But what's even more interesting, it's going to be a lot cheaper than oil and gas. And I'll show you that the capital cost per kilowatt hour of solar, of wind, and other alternatives, biomass, have dropped drastically. There are numbers that would be quite interesting to show, and how fast and how drastic the decline has been in terms of energy cost, investment cost, if nothing else. And the great thing here is this one. Look at it. I mean, whether you look at it in terms of the solar or wind or biomass, it dropped from 100,000 and one per kilowatt hour in the nuclear energy to about maybe 1,200, and in some cases $800 per kilowatt hour is the total investment needed to sustain this. And this is a massive phenomenal drop that nobody had expected it. In Canada, I looked at these things, you could see it. It's there everywhere per megawatt hour. What are the costs of just really generating this energy from the alternatives to oil and gas? And there is something quite important to emphasize. For every $1 million of investment in renewable energy, you create 3 times more jobs. It's a labor-intensive activity, and it's a skill-intensive activity. So in the sense, you're not only creating jobs, you're creating good jobs, high-paying jobs. So this is a very important and a recognized fact that most of the countries who are embarking on a transition strategy, they are using it as an employment-creating strategy, as creating good jobs strategy. It's a healthy strategy. And there is also the other aspect that when you get your energy and you're getting it so cheap, it has direct, indirect impacts and has forward and backward. One of the most important thing that I would like to emphasize here is that right now, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, have teamed with international companies to produce electric vehicles. An electric vehicle can be operated, the operating expenses is 1/5 of the comparable operating expenses of ICE, the internal combustion engine. And this is not just the operating cost is cheaper, insurance is cheaper. It's also cheaper to maintain. The maintenance cost is so much less. The ICE has 231 pieces, whereas the electric vehicle would have 12 pieces. And what's even more interesting is that it has completely the movement towards the renewable energy and the fostering of the electric vehicle industry. And our region has been a very profligate importer of automotive cars and pieces, and has drained the balance of payments in very substantial ways, that we are going basically to create the capacity to generate EVs at massive scale, and this would create a growth pole, a cluster of dynamism of the type of manufacturing that our region has so massively and so seriously lost. So without really exaggerating things, let me just mention a great experiment that has been taking place just as I'm talking in Morocco. Morocco today has the largest solar farm and have the capacity, the ability to supply most of the needed electricity. And what is more interesting and what is coming, and it's going to be a superb new advantage for the region, they can supply Africa, they can supply Europe, they can supply Spain and Portugal for most of their needs of electricity. So to a great extent, those of us who feel pessimistic that losing oil, well, good riddance, because it has been a very negative contributor to our democracy, to our sustainability, to our productivity, and we're welcoming the chance to be in the industrial world and get to the chance of being again a major source of export, and we're going to be a vibrant economy, a vibrant, sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atif, for this very interesting intervention, where we learned that even though you're not a big polluter, but you can be the most affected counterparts, I would say, or affected parts. Another message, I think, that we go out of what Dr. Atif said, that the region really needs to find and use other alternatives than fossil fuels in order to move into a more sustainable alternative, and to invest in renewable energy will lead to creating not just more jobs, but good, decent, green jobs that requires a high-skilled labor. So, and I think also Dr. Atif would have loved to talk about mainstreaming adaptation. I guess it's not just because though the panel is on green transition, but I think that it's not just mitigation that is key to our region, given the damage and loss that is inflicted on us from the most polluting parts, but also that mainstreaming adaptation will require a move from not just an incremental adaptation, but a transformative adaptation in order to reduce vulnerabilities and also increase economic resilience and achieve the development that is highly needed in the Arab countries, the ERF region, or the MENA region, wherever we would like to name it. I would like to invite our second panelist, Dr. Jufelket, to tailor maybe a framework of how to do those transformations. Thank you very much. Please, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. I will try to answer this big question indeed. So complementary to what have been tackled, we are often thinking of, the climate change as having macrostructural and financial incidents. But the structural change is as well very important, and the macro exposure inducement in the structural change has not been very studied. And even though it's really important in terms of anticipation and policy recommendation. So the team I'm leading in the AFD, the research team and the modelization part, I've developed a tool I will be presenting shortly in order to accompany the countries, to really assess the transition risk in terms of structural transformation. Because of course, the low carbon transition depends a lot of the condition of the countries, their specialization, the structure of production, the way they are, involved in the value chains, the way that the sunset industry that will be declining with the transition employs people, is linked to fiscal revenue, is linked to exports. It will be very important to have this tool in order to, afterwards plan and anticipate policy actions. So I will be just presenting you today this work. So basically, we will focus on three main aspects of the transition. The one is linked to the external exposure, the second is fiscal exposure, and the third is employment and wages. And it's really important for the structural economy. As a conceptual framework, so what we are using is really environmental multi-regional input-output table. So we are able first to, assess what the structural production involved for the country inside the country. So the link with fiscal, external, and wages and employment, so the direct impact, but also all the indirect impact given the inclusion of one country's production in the value chain. So we have a comprehensive picture of what is happening inside the country, but as well as the spillover all over the world. So then we have environmental satellite accounts being able to give us, the emission content of the production. So from then we will be able to assess, the carbon intensity per unit of production for each industry. So this will be very important to design what are the sunset industries. So basically the industries which are producing more with more emission, and then afterwards the exposure of one economy to these sunset industries being locally produced for the local or for the international production. So I don't enter into the details. You have the scan. This work has been published recently in World Development. It is on free access, so you can download all the methodology for that. And we use the Gloria database, which has just been released as an environmental MREO analysis. So here, just to mention what are the sunset industries from this analysis, and without any surprise. So the sunset industries here, you have on the endpoints of the lines are the minus and the maximum of the carbon intensity for each industry. The endpoints of the rectangles are the first and the third quartile, and the rectangle is a median. So not surprisingly, the cement, lime, and the plaster is the most emissive, and you have also the electrical power generation, transmission, and distribution. The road transport is also very emissive, gas extraction, and lignite and peat. So I don't cite all the sectors, but those are really the sunset industries. So when a country is specialized in these activities, it is likely to witness a big challenge in the low carbon transition, which is needed to be anticipated, to be tackled. But those are the potential, I would say, sunset industries, because it is likely that some industries, such as, for instance, the basic nickel will be used for the transition. So even though it is very emissive, it won't be declining because there will still be a high demand for this kind of production. It is the same for the road transport. It won't be a declining sector because it will be very used for the transition. So here are the 20 sectors which have been selected at the end for as a sunset industry, taken into account, you know, the way that they are for some of them very important for the transition. So they are in 5 main chapters of fossil fuels, metals, non-metal minerals, fertilizer, and electricity. And this is only the fossil fuel electricity that is taken into account in this context. So now, when we are applying this methodology of mapping, you know, what are the sunset industry first and the exposure of the country in terms of external. So in the vertical, you have the exposition to the external account, and horizontal, you have the taxes. We see that we have three group of countries. So we have isolated the MENA countries in the rectangles. So the dashed lines is the third quartile. So that means that the northeast of the flow mentioned the very dependent countries to both in terms of external and fiscal exposure. So from then we have 3 groups of countries. We have the Gulf countries, Algeria and Libya, which are very dependent on export and the taxes from those sunset industries. More than 75% of export and generally more or 50% for taxes. We have a second group of country still in the northeast, but little less dependent. You have Sudan, Mauritania, Iran, and Egypt. And finally, less dependent, you have Jordan, Turkey, Morocco, Tunisia, and the Lebanon. But it's not because a country is exposed to the sunset industry that it will be vulnerable, because we need to take into account the capacity of resilience of a country. That is to say, the capacity to move from brown to green industries. And this capacity has been assessed by the green potential, the green complexity potential. So this is the color of the little round you have, and the orange one is the less likely to be moving to green products, and the very blue one is the countries that are most likely to be moving. So we see that among the very exposed countries, some are very keen and very able to move to the green more complex products. And so this is an interesting topic, and this methodology have been developed by the Oxford University and by Melly and Tettelbaum. And it's really the capacity to move from a product similar to what you are producing, but which are more green. And in this case, you have Turkey, Lebanon, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco. Those countries are likely have the possibility and the capability to move forward greener products. So their vulnerability is less involved than the exposure. So now I will pass very quick, because it's the same story, but detailing, you know, which are the industries leading to this exposure and likely vulnerability. We see that, of course, the fossil fuels are very important in this exposition, both in terms of extraction and transmission, etc. But you have also the minerals. In Mauritania, for instance, is very important. And this is for the external exposure. We have the same type of analysis for the fiscal exposure, and as well, the fossil fuel is very important for as a sunset industry in all these countries. Fertilizers as well for Jordan, for instance, and Morocco. So the third type of exposition is the exposition to the socio-economic exposure. So that means that when we are moving from brown to a green industry and exposed to the low carbon transition, some people will be lagging behind. And here we have the same kind of exposure. We find the same type of countries very exposed to socio-economic risk, but it's more concentrated because we have only 2 groups of countries and not 3. Basically, the 2 first groups are very exposed, the Gulf countries, Libya, Algeria, but as well Sudan, Mauritania. And in the least exposed country, we found the same than before. And Egypt. Egypt is one of the less exposed compared to the other one. But again, we need to compare this exposure to the capacity to mitigate those risks. And so the measure we have taken into account is a social protection index from the ILO. And it means that some countries are able to provide social protection coverage at most of the percentage of the population. This is the case, for instance, of Saudi Arabia, more than 70%, Turkey, Tunisia, Libya or Iraq, and in a lesser extent, Egypt, Jordan, and Iran. And the other countries, some other countries do not have proper coverage. So the social protection coverage is really an important way to mitigate the impact of the social exposure. So if I pass rapidly, on the sectoral decomposition of the exposition, we have the same type, but you see that here what is important for wages and afterward employment is to see that a lot of this impact is indirect. That means that the sunset industries are not employing a lot of people. It's not job-intensive industries, but they are generating very high value added in the value chain. So this is more indirect impact. So finally, this is a global map of the exposure compared, and we can compare, the MENA position, the MENA countries' exposure, and this is a multidimensional, combines all the 3 type of exposition. So Egypt in the medium exposure exposed country, but we have very high exposed country, for instance, in Iraq and Syria, and all the Gulf country are very exposed externally. And as a low exposure, we have, of course, Tunisia, Turkey, and Jordan. So now, just to show you that this type of analysis is able to us also to assess the impact of the CBAM. That is really have an important impact on the countries and the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the 3 countries are likely to be very impacted in the region, so Turkey, Egypt, and Algeria. So because of aluminium or fertilizer, for instance. So as a conclusion, I have to say that this analysis is a static analysis. So this kind of input-output analysis is driven from one shot. It was done with the data of 2019. As AFD, when we want to dig really into the detail of what will be the real impact, we are responding to the command of some countries to dig into details. What we are pushing forward is really the analysis of what will be the dynamic implication of this transformation. So we will be able to have another type of model and develop a dynamic retroaction in terms of macroeconomic implication and financing and financial implication, because all of these transformations are really costly. But anyhow, we can have some of main conclusions. So what is really important is, first of all, to assess the risk, and not only the financial systemic risk. We know that there are some stranded assets, but what is really important as well is to tackle the transformation, the structural transformation, and to be prepared in terms of labor training, in terms of diversification, in terms of research and development, to be able to finance strong industrial policy. So this is really a plea for calling command and call on the policy investment in infrastructure. It will be one of the main issue in the June summit for the financing. So this is really important to be really on the good track of specialization and involved in the value chain at the regional level, not being alone, and having a green industrial policy and a green stimulus with all the policy to be designed in terms of training, as I said, and especially research and development and innovation. So we are in a university specialized in innovation, and it's really a strong need in the region. On top of that, of course, countries need to tackle climate because structural change is an impact of the climate, and so the NDCs are negotiated are very, very important. Egypt has one of more ambition NDC in the region, but this is really costly, and this I come to the financing issue, and I know that Dr. Omi will talk about that, but the financing is really a key issue, and not only the public financing, of course, the public domestic revenue, the mobilization is important. Spending efficiency as well is a very key element, and is not very tackled because it's a complicated topic, and to improve the quality and the efficiency of spending, but it's mostly important. And of course, the public financing. So as a AFD, we are a bank, and we are effectively involved in the MENA region, and we have over 12 billion commitment in the region. We have 3 billion commitment in Egypt. But as a donor, we are also involved as a quality of the aid, and what we are doing as a research department at the AFD is accompanying countries in this kind of policy design, and the amount of financing is important, but the quality and the qualitative aspect of the financing is really an important one. And finally, the private sector will need to be on board because financing mobilization is key. The amount requested for those type of transition are huge, and donors are not sufficient. But I think that the financing issue is a very acute one. It will be highly discussed in June in Paris, and it would call upon a big change in the way the international organization and all the actors are financing this transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hélène. And just a couple of reminders, announcement, given that more people are coming in. I want to remind you that we still have two distinguished panelists today. Dr. Homi Kharas, who is a senior fellow from the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institute, who is with us online, along with Kamyar Mohaddis from the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. And without a break, we will be having the closing ceremony and the distribution of the Best Paper Awards. So please don't leave the room, and stay with us, given the quite important topic that we are covering, where Hélène nicely gave us a framework of the multi-regional input-output table, and what are the sunset industries, and mapping them in order to see what are the fiscal, external, and the socio-economic exposures of the different countries of the MENA region. But remains the question that after we pursue the climate strategy ambition, in order to pursue it, is like, okay, we know we have the ambition, but how? The big question, or the $1 million question question, or billions actually question, is how to finance all this. And I think that Homi will help us see how we can finance this green transition. Homi, the floor is yours. Hope you listen, you can hear us.
Thank you so much, Professor Hala, and thank you for having me and for accommodating the fact that I can't be with you. I wish I could be with you in person, but I think I'm delighted that I'm able to participate in this fashion. So actually, Hala, it's not a million or a billion. It's a $1 trillion question, the financing question, and I wanted to start. And I'm unfortunately blocked in moving my slides. So I apologize for that. So I'm going to stop the sharing. I wanted to start by saying that there is something that's happening on the financing side, which everybody should be aware of, and that is that people have understood that much more is going to be required in terms of financing. We have a Bridgetown initiative that has been spurred by Prime Minister Mia Mottley. She's going to be one of the co-chairs of the Paris summit that Dr. Helene mentioned. They call for an additional $1 trillion in multilateral development bank climate resilience financing. The World Bank has just produced an evolution roadmap. They talk about an incremental $2.4 trillion. The Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Guterres, has come out with an SDG stimulus plan, where he talks about an extra $500 billion in MDB finance alone. Various reports coming out of the IMF, coming out of the COP27, so-called Songwe-Stern-Bhattacharya report, talk about $1 trillion. The G7 partnership talked about $600 billion in the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. So all of these are talking about major increments in external finance that will be necessary for these kinds of transitions. And my sense is that there will be some quite important departures from the way in which finance is managed at present to reflect this. So I think it's really important on the next slide to think about financing not just as being some single large number, but to really break it down into different components. And we have to talk about financing for what. And the major categories that people have talked about, I think, can be broken down into four. There's a human capital side. As Dr. Atif said, when we make this transition, we will require many more high-skilled jobs. You only get high-skilled jobs if you have people who are able to do those. That means investment in high-skilled education. But at the same time, as Dr. Helene reminded us, we're also going to have a great deal of transition in terms of employment and wages, and you need some kind of social protection. We know that the best form of resilience for individual households is for those households which have higher levels of human capital. So the human capital is both to provide the jobs of tomorrow, as well as being an investment in building up the resilience of people who will be affected. Then there's a category which is very important for the region, which we haven't talked about much, but which is the way in which land use is done, agriculture, and obviously in this region, it's going to be about water, it's going to be about irrigation. That is going to be very significantly affected, and big changes are almost certainly required in that area. Then you have the more traditional areas of adaptation and resilience. There was a lot that was discussed on this during the Sharm el-Sheikh COP27. I think people understand quite well that climate change is here. Climate change is having an impact on people. We need to build up people's capability for adapting. And then finally, let me say, the big ticket item in all of this is sustainable infrastructure. And by sustainable infrastructure, what I mean is all of the big investment, big ticket investment items that will be required as we go about this transition. Professor Atif talked about the big solar plant in Morocco. There's some discussion of a high voltage direct current that will take solar power from Morocco to the UK, to Devon. That would be the longest undersea cable ever, something like 3,600 kilometers. It's a major investment, something that's never been done before. The idea that this would simply be done by a single private company, I think, is wishful thinking. So if we want these big transformative investments to happen in these very new areas, we need a different type of financing. So what we've done in the so-called Songwestern Bhattacharya paper that I was also participated and involved with, that was presented at COP27, is to break down the financing into different types of investment. And for each type of financing, to think about the different financing sources. And these solid bars, sorry, this table is not that easy to see. So let me just go through a few of the examples. But what you see in this table is that on the left, there are some things that we anticipate that the private sector can do largely autonomously. I mean, whether it's that these are revenue generating projects, whether it is let's say energy efficiency through renewables and solar, whether it's you know, changing your trucks perhaps to either electric vehicles or to hydrogen, whether it's taking care of office buildings and things like that, and even a lot of the sustainable agriculture. Many of these will happen simply with direct private investments. We don't need to think too much about that if we get the right market signals in place. Then there's a set of private investments that will happen, but will only happen if there is some serious risk mitigation. And so one can imagine in green hydrogen, you will need that for transport and storage. You can imagine that in the power system, you might need that for some zero carbon generation activities. Then continuing to move to the right of this slide, we have many areas where the multilateral development bank system will be really important. And principal of these are the kinds of things where the public sector has traditionally taken the lead in investments. So things like the transmission and distribution of power. You know, we're talking about probably expanding electricity by about 3 times in many countries. If you expand electricity by 3 times, you need to expand the grid by 3 times. Expanding the grid has often been something that public sectors have taken on themselves. So there'll be things like that. Much of the transport infrastructure that we talk about is historically been financed by the MDBs. And many of the transition programs, I think, that Dr. Helene was talking about as selected regional, meaning subnational areas of countries try to adapt, the MDBs have an advantage of thinking through exactly what kinds of programs will help them do that. And then last, and I want to really emphasize this because it's an area of significant bottleneck at the moment. There are simply just some things where we need concessional finance, otherwise things won't get done. The easiest example, I think, is the phase out of coal. If you want companies to or countries to stop using coal, somebody has to pay for that. Otherwise, the market by itself will continue to provide an incentive to keep going. Much of the just transition set of activities will require some elements of concessional finance. And much of the nature conservation that goes along with building adaptation and resilience also doesn't generate revenues, and so is best funded through grants and other forms of concessional finance. So concessional finance is going to be a very important part of this equation, and that, as we saw with the difficulties in getting substantial amounts of money for the loss and damage fund that was announced at Sharm el-Sheikh, might be one of the hardest areas in which to make progress. So if you can move to the next slide, what we see is that financing, has to be kind of optimized by country type and by use case. And we've got a fairly simplistic matrix where you can see some of this. In some countries, domestic resource, in all countries, domestic resource mobilization will be important, but obviously in the richer countries and upper middle income countries, this will be easier, and in the poorer countries, this is somewhat harder to do. Domestic resource mobilization is of particular importance for human capital because ultimately much of that remains a public sector obligation. You also have traditional concessional official development assistance. That's really important in the agriculture areas, in adaptation and resilience, and obviously for the low-income countries. And you can move down the line. I think that what we see is that private finance on its own is largely going to come into the upper middle-income countries. Because those are the countries where the credit risk is lowest. And so, if we move to the next slide, I want to just show you one of the difficulties in finance right now in the region, and that is that many countries don't have very good credit ratings. So here I've got both the absolute level and the change over time of what's been happening to sovereign credit ratings. This is a scale. 0 is very bad. Going up, the scale goes up to 21. 21 is AAA and better. You see that not many countries in the region really enjoy strong credit ratings, Morocco probably being one of the best. I don't have all of the oil exporting Gulf states here, but some of the large countries, Jordan, Egypt, right in the middle, and then Lebanon, I think everybody knows about its difficulties. Tunisia also has some problems, and Iraq. So with weak credit ratings, it becomes very difficult for countries to mobilize affordable finance. And if the finance isn't affordable, then the economics of many of these investments turns out to be unfavorable, and the investments won't get done. If we were able to get affordable finance, then one might be able, if you move to the next slide, then one might be able to move to some scenarios where you can have a significant investment push and still have reasonably sustainable debt. But if many of these countries have to take on debt under a typical market rate, you see from this slide that what happens is that debt rapidly becomes unsustainable. And just so that would not be a feasible scenario. So part of the financing challenge is how do we get through this hump where debt ratios will rise very rapidly initially before starting to come down because growth will be higher under a big investment push. And frankly, if we can get to bringing power prices down, as Professor Atif said, to levels like 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour or something like that, the implications for growth are tremendous. So these are tremendously good growth opportunities, but there will be an interim phase where debt ratios will go up before the growth really starts to kick in. And that's the most dangerous phase from a debt sustainability point of view, and that we have to get through. And that's partly why it is so important to think about the domestic policy reforms that have to accompany higher financing. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So I've mentioned already domestic resource mobilization. We have to think hard about the debt sustainability and the management of real exchange rates. We have to think about domestic capital market development. And ultimately, much of this infrastructure, if it can be financed with local finance rather than with external finance, that would be much less risky. We have to put in place things like feed-in tariffs. My understanding is that was an extremely important innovation in Egypt for starting this process. And there can be some moves. These are still countries which have quite extensive fossil fuel subsidies, and some countries are already starting this process of transitioning from fossil fuels to cash transfer programs, for example, as in Egypt. And that would be highly desirable. So ultimately, I think, with finance, I'd like to just close by saying we do need much greater ambition. Egypt still, with its NDCs, does not actually seem to have a very, very ambitious program. Donors who are providing financing have to be much more ambitious. And countries have to be much more ambitious. Many of these projects that we see on the ground have huge returns on investment. And the big question is, how does one scale these new technologies? In order to scale in this fashion, we need to have public-private partnerships, and we need to have some assurances that the financing will be available. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Homi, very much, and thank you for drawing my attention that it's $1 trillion question, and maybe it's beyond my comprehension. But maybe Kamyar, as like a consultant at the Asian Development Bank and the regular visiting scholar at the IMF, can enlighten us, give us some insights, comments. Whatever, floor is yours. Come here. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. So as you might notice, I don't have any slides. I got a bit terrified when I saw other people's slides. Mine were only 86 pages. So I decided to condense them while talking to you. So can I just ask you one thing that I suppose, first of all, thank you for inviting us to this panel. I think it's one of the most important topics actually that we are facing, not just in this region, but actually globally in every single region. What the World Economic Forum asks every year, almost every year, 1,000 risk experts and policymakers, senior policymakers. He asks them a question, and the question is, what are the biggest threats facing the global economy? Okay. And what do you think the answer is? or there are many answers actually, to take the top 10. What do you think the answers could be? Anybody? AI? No, it's not an AI. Anybody? No? Ooh! So Matthew obviously has peeked on my slides, but it's actually not COVID. The top 3 are climate action failure, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss. I thought that's quite fascinating. And then social cohesion, conflict, and livelihood crisis, COVID or pandemics, etc., come in. So I think that's quite fascinating, because one of the things I'm going to hopefully demonstrate to you, obviously climate change is costly. It's costly for everybody. We know it's costly for this region. I want to actually say it's costly globally. It's costly for the most advanced economy in the world, United States. You have all heard me go on about it. It's costly for every sector. It's not just an agricultural story. It's impacts industries, impacts manufacturing, wholesale, resale, utilities, insurance, etc. It impacts every single industry. And just to give you an example, just how big the costs are. Earlier, the session before us, we had 3 wonderful presentations, and one of them was citing data from NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And NOAA started classifying these things called billion-dollar disasters. So, and we have had in 2021, I think they tallied $20 billion disasters in the US. By the way, this is just in terms of physical damages. It's not in terms of human suffering. And the biggest one was in 2017. I think it was Harvey and Irma. And the cost was $366 billion to the United States. And we have examples from Pakistan, etc. So these are very expensive events that are happening. We're talking about very expensive investments, but we also have to remember we are experiencing huge economic losses by inaction. So, and arguably United States have adapted, but is still experiencing these massive losses. So that's one of the things that I wanted to touch on. I think we don't understand the risks. So I'm going to first be very depressing, and then I'm going to hopefully give you some hope for optimism. So one of the things that for financial markets to make any decision, we need to understand risk. Financial markets are extremely important here, as we just heard. We need financing for the net zero world transition, and in particular for this region. We don't understand the risk. So we have some colleagues from the World Bank. I apologize, but not so long ago, the outgoing president obviously had a not such a great interview with the New York Times, where he did not acknowledge that climate change was human inflicted, partly at least. We had an event with FT's Moral Money Summit. I don't know those of you who watched that. That was also very interesting. So that was with Stuart Kirk from the HSBC. Apologize to anybody from the banking sector, where Stuart Kirk basically, one of the things he said was, this by the way was company line. It wasn't Stuart Kirk had gone crazy. He basically said how, he said, who cares if Miami is 6 feet underwater? Amsterdam has been 6 feet underwater for century, and it's an absolutely wonderful place to live. So HSBC, obviously they're supposed to facilitate the lending, as is the World Bank. And then I want to also finish up with one thing, which is an oil company, fossil fuel company. So I don't know if you know the British Petroleum. Used to be called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and then Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And BP in 2020, the CEO, the chief executive, Bernard Looney, said, I think it's very clear to any of us that society wants a different energy solution. And so they committed to basically, I think it was reducing production by 40%, oil and gas production by 40% from 2019 to 2030. I don't know if you heard what he said a month ago, which was, governments and societies around the world are asking companies like ours to invest in today's energy systems. In other words, and they gave up on their goal of 40% reduction in fuel. So just some glimpses into private sector, fossil fuel, banks, World Bank, who is hopefully going to help us help developing countries in their transition. If they don't understand the risk or take these risks seriously, I think it's very difficult to really advance the agenda. So that's my sad thing about it. So I was really pleased that you talked about affordability. don't worry, I'm going to finish in 50 minutes or so. Is that right? 5, sorry, I meant 5. Yeah, Freudian. One thing we saw earlier was about sovereign credit ratings. In fact, together with Matthew Agarwala, some of you know, and Patty Kluzak, who are both here, and Matt Burke and Maurice Kramer, we did a study where we looked at what would happen to actually sovereign ratings if you started to take into account this climate risk. So, and if the rating agencies actually price this in, or we have what we call the climate smart sovereign ratings, what you would notice is that for pretty much all of the sovereigns, you would see a downgrade. It doesn't matter whether you're an advanced or emerging or developing country, you would see a downgrade by the end of this decade, by 2030. So the cost of the transition will go up. So if we start to incorporating this risk. So that's the connection I wanted to make, that we don't understand the risks. If we did understand the risks, or indeed if we price the risks, actually the transition and we don't, and in action, transition could be extremely expensive. So it's possibly better to, most definitely it's better to do it now. Okay, the last sad point is obviously we've had 27 years of UN COP meetings. The last one was close to here. I think we're still seeing greenhouse gas emissions rising, which is very sad. In fact, UN in COP27, I think in their publication they wrote something. I took a note. It says we are heading to 2.4 degrees as it is. We were meant to limit it to 1.5, less than 2, but ideally 1.5 in Paris. We are basically heading towards 2.4, and it's obviously I think they said something like willfully insufficient actions and et cetera, et cetera. So, and on top of all of this, so we don't understand the risks. We have a climate crisis. We also have multiple economic and political shocks, which has led us to talk about polycrisis or permacrisis. So things are really bad. But what are the sort of optimism? So I'm going to finish on this. So I want to be last session. We should end with an optimism. So I think one of the things which Atif also referred to is that there are grounds for optimism. And one of the things I want to talk about, the governments are actually, you might find that interesting, but I think governments are a real source of optimism. And I give you an example from a country which, under the Trump administration was not such a good climate champion, I would suggest. Joe Biden's IRA, which we've heard in some of the plenary sessions. It's an unfortunate name. It's not nothing to, it's the Inflation Reduction Act, not the, yeah. Anyways, and the IRA is very interesting because we had the midterm elections, and usually what you would see is that the Republicans would be trashing the IRA. And what you noticed, there was very, very little mention of the IRA in the campaign trail. So I think that's a really positive thing. What interesting about the IRA, I was reading some numbers. Let me give you some numbers about how much. So it's about $370 billion, but that's not actually what have I done with my numbers? The numbers were obviously too big. They've fallen off. I see. I probably put them. Anyways, the crowding in is obviously quite substantial in the case of the US. Yeah. Okay. I can't find the numbers, but they were striking, and from both private sector estimates and from public sector estimates, how much projects and how many new jobs would be created because of the IRA, and that's just purely in the United States. Obviously, EU has is also trying to basically lead to massive investments. Okay, so that's one reason. The other reason I think is very also was alluded to is about payments for climate damage. Now there are many details to be determined about what that actually means, but that's actually a really important, and from COP27, this was a very important action. And then the other bit, I suppose, is public-private funding. And we've seen some of that. It's quite disappointing still at this stage, but Indonesia was announced in, I think, November 2022, and we had South Africa in 2021. They don't amount to big amounts of, in terms of dollars. There's something, I think, hoping to mobilize 10 billion, but still, it's actually a huge improvement. And then COP15, I don't know, was it COP15? I can't quite remember now. I think it was COP15, where people gathered and were, I think it was pretty much every country except for the US and the Vatican that signed it. But they basically, I think it was a historic agreement to protect nature. So it was not talking about climate change, but it was nature. And one of the biggest, I think, accomplishment, or at least one of the most prominent was the 30 by 30. So 30% of land and sea under protection by 2030. Again, many of those details need to be worked out. And the final bit of optimism, I suppose, is you notice that younger generations, I mean, do surveys of how people think, and I'm not sure they're 100% accurate, but they tell you something. And what you tend to see is that the generation that's coming in, the generation that's going to be voting, actually are much more left-leaning in the way they think about how we distribute and think about welfare. So that, to me, is an extremely important sort of change to what we have seen. Okay, so what do we need to do? And the final piece, which is tied to, I don't know, how many of you went to the tour of the Nile entrepreneurs? Did I get that right, Hassan? Was it Nile entrepreneurs? Nile, yes, it was, wasn't it? Yeah, Nile entrepreneurs. And actually, it's innovation. And the final piece is we know that we basically need to increase economic activity. And those of you who paid attention in your environmental courses know about the Kaya identity. There's three ways essentially to doing this. One is to reduce the population, which is probably not desirable, or let's not talk about that one. The other one is essentially to degrowth. And the third option is to have green growth. And what was fascinating about going around and seeing the projects is that there is a lot of emphasis actually on looking at the both manufacturing side, software, etc. Not just here, but actually globally, is about green growth, innovation in the green space. And that's going to create not only just jobs, but also is going to allow us to not degrowth. So we create opportunities for people. And I don't think degrowth is an option, because if we degrowth, so if I'm talking about from advanced economy perspective or middle income economy, it means we demand fewer goods and services from those countries that are providing, so the emerging and poor developing countries. I'm not sure that's an ideal solution, but green growth seems to be a smart solution. So, and that ties with what we were talking about moving away to renewable energy in some of the parallel sessions, and what the things are being done here in the Nile University. So I have 32 more slides. Should I stop?
Yeah, and you can do them after the closing.
Okay, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Kamiar, for leaving us on an optimistic note, and that many green things and innovations are just happening outdoors of this room. And I think we still have some time for a couple of questions. Please, a microphone over there. Can you introduce yourself and try to a question, please.
And I'm also a research fellow at the CPR in London, UK. Now, I understand that some of our colleagues here are coming from policy institutions like the World Bank or other, very important policy institutions that are seeking to find global answers to global solutions. But I'm an academic economist, and I tend to be a little bit picky about details. So one thing that I noticed, for example, in the debt slides and the debt sustainability slides, was the extreme heterogeneity of the countries that are being considered. For example, the Lebanon, Iraq, and Tunisia were one group, and Egypt and some of the other countries were another group. Egypt was in much better shape relative to Lebanon, let's say. But then if you put them all together, what is the policy recommendation? Now, when it comes to green growth financing of green growth, climate policies, I sort of again see a sort of a one size fits for all, or an approach that doesn't take into account the historical and cultural differences that we have in the globe. Now, why should HSBC finance green growth in Egypt? Okay, I don't see a reason. It was developed in a very different conjuncture. It was developed in China to, it's very different. It's a global bank. But what about local banks financing or regional banks financing green growth? In other words, let's take into account the heterogeneity, one, and two, the incentives. So, what incentive does HSBC have to finance green growth in Sudan or Egypt or anywhere? But a local bank might, because something that happens in one country, which is its neighbor, might have spillover effects like refugees, etc. So then you could develop a local bank. And I didn't see, now in Asia, there are AIIB, ADB, there are local groupings that seek to do some of this, but I didn't see, maybe I came to the session late, I didn't see a discussion of these local incentive-based solutions that take into account historical and cultural aspects of even financial markets, okay? Our financial markets are not neutral. They were developed in 500 years of industrial revolution to benefit certain groups of countries. Okay, now the world is changing. So I would, this is my question.
Can you wrap up, please?
Yes. Where is the heterogeneity and where are the incentives?
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, please. Dr. Abir Shenawi from the AUC, American University in Cairo, please.
I just want to ask Dr. Helen, what kind of green industrial policies are you proposing? Could you please a little bit discuss more what are the kinds of these policies?
Thank you. Dr. Hiba Handousa.
I'd very much like to hear from the panel how they envisage regional cooperation. I've heard the word, the sentence of how we need to have regional cooperation. I mean, as an economist, it makes a lot of sense since we are one region, and in one of the meetings we had upstairs, it was made very clear that our region, in the Middle East, the Arab world, the heterogeneity across the region is amazing. So it's very clear that there's got to be some minimum amount of regional cooperation in terms of who's going to save energy in what way and how we're going to clean up the environment, etc., etc. But I don't see any solution being suggested by anyone in the last 4 days. So
I
I'd
guess
very
that
much
this would
like
be
to
a
hear
great
something.
question for the next year's panel. Give an idea to the managing committee. Sorry,
Or just very
okay.
simply, where do
Where-
we have regional cooperation in the future? What are the members of the panel suggesting?
Yes, thank you very much. Please. Yes, Klaus.
Thank you very much, Klaus Bethebel. Fascinating topic, fascinating panelists. Congratulations. 3 very brief questions, remarks. I don't know what they are. On the optimistic side, Kamian, you presented a pessimistic panorama regarding the increase in decline in sovereign debt ratings, increase in the cost of capital. On the same side, you said it is good that the young people are much more conscious about the future and they're innovators. If they care more about the future than us, it implies lower subjective discount rates. So the cost of capital on that account should counterweigh the increase in the cost of capital which you mentioned. That's on the optimistic side. On the pessimistic side, your bet is that these young people are sufficient innovators so that they will prevent us from getting into doom. But on that, I'm skeptic. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. Yours is a bet that the rate of innovation is large enough to produce the technological changes which should come. The biggest regarding climate change, technological challenge is to have hundreds of machines who can absorb the excessive CO2 and CO2 equivalent gases from the atmosphere. And we're far away from that. Question is, we can achieve that. That's it.
Thank you very much. The last question will be from Dr. Amira Al-Haddad. Please, a question, Dr. Amira.
Thank you. Thank you, Hela. I actually don't have a question. I have a comment to Kamyar about the Inflation Reduction Act, which he seemed to put in a positive way, but the Inflation Reduction Act is actually a disaster. And it was actually designed with a battle with China, massive subsidies for green technology and for for green technologies and for semiconductors, so that investments go out of China and trade goes out of China into the US. But at the same time, this has a side effect that it also diverts trade and investment out of emerging markets, out of some developing countries, and will create a retaliation from the other parts of the world in a war of protectionism and increased protectionism that will cost the world a lot of money. The second point I wanted to make is that green technologies aren't necessarily employment intensive. They are mostly capital intensive. And for instance, Germany is thinking of doing these PTX funds and projects. There will be an issue of governance, which companies will get these projects, how will the revenues be distributed, will there be technological transfer? So a lot of industrial policy issues shouldn't be left out of our discussion of the green transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Amira. I'll go back to the panelists. I'll give 1 minute to everybody, because everyone will have 1 minute, because I guess I will never be invited to the ARF conference anymore because I couldn't keep the time. Kamyar.
So you might not know this, but I'm a Gemini, and I see things from two points of views. But yeah, I agree with you. I think I'm not saying technologies on the green growth as well. I'm not saying that technology is the only solution. Green technology is not a solution. I completely get that, and I think it's dangerous to say technology is a solution when it comes to climate change, because that means that we basically postpone our decision, knowing that in the future there will always be something that can be done, and then eventually it's too late, or maybe it's too late already. So I completely agree on that. Yes, you're right. On one hand, I suppose the story is credit ratings. The things that we've done, we are projecting that credit ratings, the sovereign ratings would actually, there will be downgrades for sure. And on the other hand, if the new generation come in and will implement these changes, which will lead to a lower cost of borrowing. So it could offset to some extent, but I'm not that optimistic by 2030 that will happen, I suppose. And yeah, I just one final bit on, 10 seconds, Inflation Reduction Act. I agree with you. I think
you can pick up this discussion over dinner, I guess.
This is going to be a very long dinner.
So we don't want it to be a long panel.
I got the hint, Hala.
2 minutes if you want to reflect on any of the questions from the floor.
Does it get 2 minutes? I want to go watch that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So very quickly on regional cooperation. I think there's just so much to be done. Many of there are some things which are real regional projects. So if you want to think about a grid, it might be that the most efficient grid is within a country. It might be that the most efficient grid is going to be cross national borders. So there are all kinds of things like that. Personally, I think that there's a huge area for regional cooperation on the development of projects and pipeline of, what is the pipeline of projects going to be, putting heads together and thinking about exactly where and who should be doing what, I think could be very useful. And I think that there's a huge amount of regional cooperation that's feasible on the human capital side. There will be movements of people. There will be all kinds of differences, thinking about how the region wants to think about the ways in which it protects its people is going to be very important. Finally, I'm not sure I quite understood the question about the heterogeneity of countries. My point was simply to point out that there are countries have very different credit ratings and therefore need to think about very different ways of getting the finance for some of these transformations. More creditworthy countries can rely more heavily on private markets. Less creditworthy countries have to rely more heavily on official institutions.
Thank you,
And the domestic institutions, the domestic financing institutions are of huge importance, as I think I mentioned.
Great. Thank you very much. Hélène?
Yes, so for the financing, domestic financing is key. I think the private, banks won't have the incentive. It's a question of, because we are still in a scheme of having a short-run profitability. We are pushing a lot on National Development Bank because it's really important source of financing and it's driven by the state. We are leading a coalition, the Financing Common Coalition, and it's really important. So yes, it's absolutely key. It's absolutely key to finance regional economies of scale because regional aspect is important for technology. So I would add to what has been said on the technology aspect. Is really important to approach it in a regional aspects. And on the green policies, I won't have a single answer because it has been said each country has its own trajectory. So what I've presented is a broad analysis, a static one. We need to dig further, but what is key is it seems to prove that you have green products. You have the OECD, you have the World Trade Organization, you have the APEC, Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, which have put the list of the green products, insert in the value chain. So I guess what is really in the next step is to dig in what all the MENA countries could approach in this kind of production. And we have seen that most of the countries, some of them are really prompt to enter in this green transition.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atif.
Yeah, I don't like to think of this money as finance. I like to think of it as compensation. After, COP27, the world accepted loss and damage, and this is the kind of bill that we should be preparing so we get this compensation rather than just loans or money that are being advanced. This is investment. If we really think of the regional cooperation, that the environment is a regional public good, that it's an international public good. This is the universe that we all belong to. And it's our responsibility as trustees of this to invest into the sustainable future we want. But also the Arab world, you cannot really have a feasible and acceptable transition strategy without looking at it as a regional project, in the sense that how on earth you're going to sell the excess energy to faraway places where you could sell it to people close by. How could you possibly have better investment, whether you are in Saudi Arabia or any place else, than in supporting and sustaining the development of the neighboring countries that have been always willing and ready and capable of supplying the kind of goods and services of food that you would need. The other aspect that to a great extent people are not accepting and technological solutions, some have really advanced degrowth. Not that there will be zero growth for every country, but it is time that the countries that had taken advantage in the past of colonialism and advanced themselves, this is the time to yield space for the countries that are poor and lagging to come ahead. Because if we continue all to grow and there is only one single cell that has the objective growth is the cancerous cell. The rest of us, we really need to think of alternative ways and see in what way and how can we possibly get our work, get our economies working in a cooperative way, but also in a balanced and in an equitable way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atif. I will not attempt into summarizing, but to thank everybody and maybe to invite Dr. Ibrahim to the stage and